Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're very excited to be here and kick off Commencement Week. If you would please welcome President Wrighton to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second in a series of conversations with retired Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. We will also have the Dean of the George Washington University School of Law, Dana Matthew. She will be interviewing the justice. This is certainly a good example of what we call here at the university an only at GW moment. Justice Breyer has kindly consented to come to GW, and only GW, 5 times over this and the next academic year. He will be discussing his career, including the many influential people with whom he worked and from whom he learned so much on his path to the Supreme Court. Today, he and Dean Matthew will be focusing on 3 parts of his life. First, his time at Harvard Law School as a student in the 1960s, which was a very different time for law schools than today. And then his return 3 years later as a teacher and as a colleague to the very professors who taught him. Second, he's going to be talking about his clerkship with Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg. And third, his 2 years with the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. I'd like to share a little bit about both the Justice and Dean Matthew before we begin the conversation. Born and raised in San Francisco, Justice Breyer did his undergraduate work at Stanford and then studied at Oxford before going to law school at Harvard. While teaching at Harvard, the future justice took time off to work with Senator Edward Kennedy on the Judiciary Committee. Following that, he was appointed to the Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, later becoming Chief Judge, and also serving as an initial member of the U.S. Sentencing Commission. He was named to the Supreme Court by President Bill Clinton in 1994 and served for 28 years until his retirement last June. Lest anyone think that the justice has really retired, he's now working on his 8th published book, not counting textbooks, while also teaching a couple of courses at Harvard, continuing to give talks in many locations, and working on projects for the American Bar Association and others. Clearly, he's not retired. Dean Dana Matthew also has a distinguished career, if not quite as long as the justices. I've come to know her as a great leader here at GW, and I value very much the opportunity to work with her. She has plenty of time to catch up on the justice, and she is also a graduate of Harvard as an undergraduate, and then attended the University of Virginia Law School. She has also a PhD in Health and Behavioral Sciences from the University of Colorado at Denver. Prior to becoming the dean of our law school, Dean Matthew taught law at the Universities of Colorado and at the University of Virginia. Dean Matthew is a leader in public health and civil rights law who focuses on disparities in health, health care, and the social determinants of health. She is also the author of 2 books, the best-selling, quote, Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare, and the recently released, quote, Just Health, Treating Structural Racism to Heal America. Distinguished guests, I present to you Justice Stephen Breyer and Dean Dana Matthew.
Good.
We're in the back talking, and I thought, oh God, I hope my mic's not on. So I'm glad to hear it's on. Welcome, Justice. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much.
We feel so privileged because we feel as though we have the definitive oral history of the arc of your career.
We're just talking about the Middle Ages today.
Well, I'm going to get started on the Harvard Law School. In our first conversation, we learned that you grew up in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And you went to Stanford undergraduate. What made you choose Harvard? I mean, have you heard they fell in the rankings? I mean,
We didn't have rankings at that time.
well, that's why you didn't know.
That must have been. I was in England for 2 years. I'd studied in England. And Harvard's halfway, you see, between Oxford and San Francisco. Perfect, because then I ended up marrying, my wife is from England, so we're right between two sets of parents, and perfect. You go there, I forget that story. Let's go.
But it was very different then, wasn't it? It was 500 men and 14 women. And I heard you had a tradition, I don't know if it was yours, called Ladies' Day.
Most of my 540, let's not exaggerate. 526 men and 14 women. Well, I mean, it was weird for me because I grew up in San Francisco, and in the West, everything was co-ed. That was true my entire education, really. Even at Stanford, a third were women, a third of the students. And so it was, we'd come there, Paul Dodig, a good friend of mine, and I had both been at Oxford, and there we are in the Harvard Law School. And you know, in England, people might take everything studying very seriously, but they pretend they're not. And you get to Harvard, it's the opposite, or at least everybody's working very hard all the time. So we thought that was sort of funny. And I said, Judy Hope is here. We had a group of friends, and Ann Dudley Cronkite, and we'd go out and we'd between classes, we'd go to what we called the Harkness Monster, which is the Harkness dorm, and we'd have a cup of coffee and talk about the classes or talk about anything came into our head. So law school was okay, you know, but fine. It was, we had sometimes a good time and sometimes not. And you ought to read her book, by the way, which is called, and Pearls, Pinsuits and Pearls.
Pinstripes and Pearls?
Yeah, Pinstripes and Pearls. And you will see. And I will say, even then, Dodig and I, you know, we thought this is ridiculous not having women there, frankly. But they were having a tougher time than we thought. And we're having drinks with them. We're, you know, these are friends of ours, but they were having a tougher time than we thought. And she follows in that book. She follows what happened to the women in our class. And it wasn't so easy. And why I think people should read the book is now, okay, I understand their problems and so forth. But I think you can put yourself back at a time. Erwin Griswold.
I was going to say, he asked that question at dinner parties, didn't he? He said...
Asked the question.
Yes.
He always had the fourth. Look, the argument against. I just read an interesting article called The Problem, and it is a problem for historians. It's called presentism. And the problem is that when you're writing about the past, and he starts with, you know, Hartley's thing, the past is a foreign country, and people do things differently there. And they did. And you have to try to bring yourself to understand the state of mind. The state of mind of Erwin Griswold and Barton Leach and a lot of the faculty was, well, these are all jobs that are going to men. Why should a woman have one?
That's the question.
You've
he
got
used to ask women, why are you here at Harvard?
Why are you here at Harvard? The best answer, oh, no, but he would do that, not in his office. He always had one dinner party for the women. So the women then are all lined up in the chairs. And they know he's going to ask that question. So Ann Dudley, when he got around to her, he says, well, why are you here at Harvard? And she says, because I couldn't get into Yale. I thought that was pretty good. And Barton Leach, he'd never call on a woman in class, but he'd have Ladies' Day, and he'd only call on the women. And you see, Dodig and I would think that was funny because it's so ridiculous. But if you were one of the 14 women, it wasn't so funny. and they had a harder time. They just had a harder time. There we are. But it's important to remember that, know about it, try to put yourself in the state of mind A good book that I recommend to people is Willa Cather, whom I like, Pioneers. It's in Nebraska. And you go to Nebraska now, you drive on a superhighway, I guess. But that wasn't true when the people first went there. And these people who first went there, old as they are, they're not old, but important to remember. I think it's important to remember. Important to remember those days. But the classes were fine. The classes were good. I probably owe my appointment to the Supreme Court that I paid a lot of attention to A.J. Kasner, my property teacher.
Is it your property? I thought it was
Yeah.
because you were articles editor on the Law Review.
You know, in the article, I don't want to make myself look too ridiculous, but I sat there in the articles office with Freddie Truslow, and we wouldn't let anyone in. And that's because we were trying to figure out how something I learned at boys' camp is if you have Coca-Colas, which we'd order in, and you blow the straw up, can you get it to stick at the ceiling? And an interesting task if you. I don't want to suggest you would do it, such a stupid thing now. But we wouldn't let anyone in, and we'd do what we wanted, read comic books or whatever. But yeah, no. A.J. Kasner taught property the way it'll never be taught again. It was very interesting. I found it very interesting. We learned about English property law and what's a springing use and a civil use, and I thought that was really interesting. It had nothing to do with anything that anyone was ever going to practice, as far as I could see. Perfect. And so one day I'm working for Senator Kennedy, and he asked me I get a message, he wants me to come in the office because he's talking to Tom Winship. They don't know who Tom Winship was. But Tom Winship was the editor of the Globe. And if you are a senator from Massachusetts, Tom Winship is an important person, and he was a great person, actually. And somehow they'd gotten into a discussion about springing and shifting uses.
So it did become useful to you.
Well, Kennedy says, what, you know the difference between a springing and a shifting use? I said, well, I think I do, actually. I mean, a springing use, you go like this, and the guy has a life estate, and you're here. And the shifting use is you keep the property until something goes wrong, and then whoop, it goes on like that, you see. And so ever after, when Kennedy would see me in the hall, he'd go. So I'm sure he took in, I really knew law, so therefore he nominated me to the First Circuit. Right.
Please don't tell me you know the rule against perpetuity.
No, Leach taught the rule against perpetuities. He'd written a book on it. And Kasner never taught the rule against perpetuities. In hindsight, I'd say maybe he was very jealous of Leach. I don't know. Not the rule, yes.
Well, back then, did you go straight from law school to the Supreme Court clerkships? People
Yes.
do a lot different pathways today. What was your path to Justice Goldberg?
He called up Al Sachs, who taught legal process, and said, do you have anybody who you think would be a good clerk? And Sachs recommended me.
So you had him as a sponsor, so to speak.
Well, I'm more than a sponsor. He told Goldberg I'd be a good person to hire. Goldberg wanted to meet me. And at that time, so this is a long time ago, you remember, it's the only time in my life that I actually was wearing a beard. And because everybody was in those days. Don't ask me why. Somehow they thought it was okay. And Goldberg came up to Harvard, and I had a chance to meet him. And he said, well, you have to shave off that beard. Earl Warren said the same thing, because that summer we went over and worked on the Warren Commission as law clerks, doing checking.
And he made you shave your beard?
Not me, it was a different person.
Because you had shaved yours already.
Mine was already shaved. So then I went down to see Goldberg's office when I saw him in his office. The two clerks, there were only two clerks then for each justice. It was fun, it was interesting, because you got to know the judge much more. And his two clerks that previous year were Lee McTernan and Alan Dershowitz. And they were working on, I can't remember what they were working on when I walked in. But I thought I would like it, and I did like it. Goldberg was wonderful to clerk for. It was Steve Goldstein and me, and there were all these cert petitions. And anyway, all the cert petitions that there were, which were about the quarter of the number now, were worked on by one extra clerk whom the Chief Justice had who worked for Warren. That was Dennis Flannery, I think, was the chief. Then he had somebody, and they would type. You see, we didn't have
word processing.
We did have automobiles. I wanted you to know about it. We did, but we didn't have Xeroxes, and so it was on what were called flimsies, which he typed up 7 copies, and would send them around. Each chambers would get a copy, and we'd read through them. Goldberg would read through them, and the other ones, and we get about 25 a week that were paid petitions. And those paid petitions, Goldstein and I read and wrote a 2-page, 3-page memo for Goldberg, and Goldberg read them, and we would discuss them. But we worked on Saturdays then, too.
And
They haven't even heard of that. Somebody
No,
working on
we work
Saturday.
on Saturdays,
But we worked
yeah.
on Saturday morning, and then Goldberg would take us to Duke Siebert's. I don't know if anybody remembers Duke Siebert's. Yeah, it was a good place for lunch. And there was another place the other direction. Been trying to remember the name of that. Sans Souci, that was a good one. But there was somebody that was a liquor, a whiskey warehouse. It was a wholesale liquor. What? Crownheim, that was it. And after we went, we would go with Justice Brennan and Justice Marshall in later years. Feinberg and I. Well, the Crownheim, I've been trying to think that for some time. And they had very good corned beef, pastrami sandwiches.
I was going to ask you what was your most memorable opinion that you worked on with Justice Goldberg, but maybe your most memorable meal might be better.
Oh, he invited us for Passover dinner all the time. We'd always go there. We often went to his house for dinner. For Passover dinner, he'd have all of his labor friends. And we'd sit around the table and we would sing labor songs. We did. It was pretty good. You can't hurt me. I'm working for the union. I'm working for the union. I'm working for that, and so forth. Anyway, I'll spare you my voice. But and it was fun. And he knew all those songs that he made and so forth. But and we worked Saturday, and then we go to lunch. Yeah. But the work was the same. The work was except there is this difference. In retrospect, I would say in 64, 65. It's a court with a mission. There's no question. It's 10 years since Brown. And the country is really not. I imagine that Prince Edward's Island had been reformed, but I'm not positive by then. It's 10 years, and the segregation is still there, illegal segregation. And it's a court with a mission. And the mission is to get Brown enforced. And you know who is helping them? Nobody. I mean, virtually. That isn't quite true, but virtually. And it's after Little Rock, and you would say the most memorable thing, the Heart of Atlanta. Heart of Atlanta was that year, Ollie's Barbecue. And they finally got the public accommodations law passed. And there was a question in the court because of the Commerce Clause.
Yes.
And the court affirmed, said it's good law. But those were probably the most important cases that year. Whew. And would it? I mean, but it's just beginning. You see, the civil, to me, looking back at it, the real reason that Ollie and let's say Governor Falbus and a few others could not succeed, even though they could close the school in Little Rock, even though Central High School was closed, even though 9 judges signed an opinion saying you can't close it, he closed it, okay? And so what are they supposed to do? They're sitting up in their offices? And who is going to do what? And the Eisenhower, which I think is one of the best things he ever did, had sent troops already, the 1,000 troops, to Little Rock. And they'd been there, and they took those 9 children by the hand and walked into Central High School. And they'd been there for several months, and then it was closed. You see. And so when I talk about this in a more formal setting, what I'll do is I say, look, it was too late. I'd say, I'd like you to think this has a happy ending. 9 judges signed the opinion saying, whoa, wait a minute, it was still closed. And I'd say, but that was the moment when Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, the Freedom Riders, the country had begun to wake up. And it was those people who weren't judges and who weren't lawyers and who got on those buses and went down there that sort of made clear, to others, what was going on, what was going on. And that, I think, what I told, the story means something to me and does to anybody, but the woman who was Chief Justice of Ghana, she says, in our office, because she's trying to have more civil rights and so forth. She said, why do people do what you say? I can't give her an easy answer. I can say, I tell her the story of Little Rock and the story of the Freedom Riders going down, and I say, contrary to popular belief, it's sort of a joke, but it's sort of true. 331 million of the 332 million in the United States are not lawyers or judges. And they're the ones you have to convince that a rule of law is important. And they were the ones that had to go down and say, yes, we are going to get rid of legal segregation anyway. And eventually, yeah, but that was the court at my time. That is not the court I've served on. That isn't the court I served on even 20 years ago, because it wasn't as single-minded, you see, in its approach. There wasn't that major.
You know, I'm not supposed to talk about the court you served on or the court today, but I can't resist, because race is again at the center of some of the most important decisions about to be decided by the court. So we know that Students for Fair Admissions has sued both Harvard, your alma mater, and UNC, and many of the precedents that you wrote on are going to be at issue then. So you wrote separately in Gratz, right? You wrote in Grutter, you joined Justice Kennedy, you joined the majority in Fisher, and those are opinions that are going to be up for consideration. What should we expect, do you think?
That's what I can't answer. And there are two reasons for answering. One, not answering that, what we should expect. The first reason is because it's a case right before the court. And people will assume the answer to the second question is, of course, I don't know. So I could be as willing as I want to shift whatever I want in question one, but I don't know. We'll find out.
You know, I had to ask.
No, it's fine. I mean, you can ask. There's no problem with your asking anything you would like to ask. The problem comes up if I choose to answer.
Ah, yes, of course. And he told me that before.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Justice Goldberg. I would like to know what you remember about his decision to leave the court and go to the United Nations.
I was clerking for him at that time.
Yes. Yeah.
Goldstein and I. And it wasn't just because he wanted to get away from his two clerks. You have to go back. You see, that's why you have to go back. Not only was there, say, the segregation, but this was during Vietnam. And so I say to the students who are interested now, I mean, we lived through that rather difficult period. And, you know, when I first started teaching at Harvard, I would go over with Archie Cox in the evening, and we'd have to spend the evening in Widener Library so the students wouldn't burn it down. So I'd say to the students, you know, I am not personally responsible for the war in Vietnam. I don't even like the idea. But it was tough. And if any of you have not seen Bobby Kennedy's speech in Indianapolis on the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, you go home tonight and look at it and see. It's a great speech. It's a great, great speech. And he talks about Aeschylus and the pain and the suffering and so forth. It's a great speech. And then you think that just a few years before, his brother had been murdered. Mm. And then you think that in just a few weeks, he too will be murdered. And then you think that on that very day, Martin Luther King was murdered. Let alone the students at Kent State. Let alone the fires. Let alone the burning downs and the strikes and the desert. Yes, it was not an easy time. Not at all. And this, perhaps it's age or whatever it is, but I tend to think what goes on now, I'm certainly hope we all get together and sort of stops what's going on now. But the Vietnam period, we survived that. Mm-hmm. We survived that. And so anyway, Goldberg, I have pieced quite a lot together because he also knew Pat Moynihan pretty well. In fact, Pat Moynihan was Goldberg's assistant when Goldberg was Secretary of Labor. which is a job he loved, very active person, Goldberg, and he'd set up task forces on the minimum wage, and he'd set up task forces on integration in the unions and all sorts of things before he was appointed to the Supreme Court. All right, when we're there, we know, I mean, Jack Kennedy thought that Arthur Goldberg, I believe this from several sources, he thought that Arthur Goldberg was the smartest man he ever met. And he also thought, of course, he was grateful because Goldberg had introduced him to all his union friends, which led to his nomination and eventually his election. But, and Goldberg, he sent on all kinds of things. We saw he'd have a problem with the opera strike up in New York. He sent after he's on the court. Goldberg went up and he solved the opera strike problem, and he would send him around to defense bases where there was something wrong. And so Goldberg did not suffer from what you might call a false sense of confidence. he had, but he was fun. He was great. Okay. So what I do believe happened, and I've talked to Fran Gilbert, who listened to every telephone call Goldberg was ever on. He's an assistant over there. And Johnson did call him several times and said he wanted him to replace Adlai Stevenson. And what I think he said in those calls, which Fran confirmed, because I knew fairly well Saul Linowitz. Saul Linowitz was a very good friend of Lyndon Johnson and was our ambassador to the OAS and sat in on every cabinet meeting. And I'll deviate for 1 second because you'll know those cabinet meetings. Johnson hated the cabinet meetings. Johnson would turn his chair around and sit the other way. But if you want an explanation of Vietnam, he gave that to me one day. He said, he's sitting there, and one of the cabinet members says, well, we should do this. This is what we really should do, but we can't afford it. And he says, we really can't do it. And suddenly, Johnson turns around like this, and he puts his finger down like that, pointing to the man who spoke. And he said, we can't, never, I never want to hear those words in this room. He said, this is the United States of America, and we can do anything. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, I say, now I get it, Vietnam. I see. Okay. Well, anyway, Linowitz knew him. And Linowitz is at Adlai Stevenson's funeral. And suddenly in comes Air Force One with President Johnson. And Arthur Goldberg gets off the airplane with him. And Linowitz thinks to himself, my God, he's going to appoint Johnson. Appoint Goldberg to replace Adlai Stevenson. And Fran and others say, look, did Johnson offer him something? No, he did not. He did not. He probably said what Fran said he said, which I told anyways. He said, he would have said, look, Arthur, the most important problem facing this country is Vietnam. I intend to solve that problem at the UN. And you are the only person who can do that. And Goldberg would have thought that's probably true. And Linowitz said, and he might have added this, and Arthur, the man who solves the problem of Vietnam can do anything. Goldberg thinks President of the United States. That's what I think. And when we went to the confirmation hearing, Dorothy Goldberg, who was lovely, she said to Steve and me, if you're ever on the Supreme Court, don't quit. Well, 28 years, you know. But there we are. And that's what I think happened. Now, I know he spoke to Brennan, and I know he spoke to the chief, Warren. And he said, can I do this? Should I do it? And they both agreed that it was more important, and he should.
What a great story.
Well, it's true, I believe. And there we are. And that's, the country has, that's what Kennedy used to say. The country goes like this, We go like this. But when you're over here, don't worry, it'll get back over here. And so there we are. And well, that's the history of that.
So your next stop, I think, was the Department of Justice?
Oh, yeah, I worked for Don Turner. Don Turner, I'd taken antitrust law from at Harvard.
So
was
antitrust
great,
law
very nice.
then
Yeah,
and now, very different? Why?
Well, it's getting back, I think, but we hadn't seen too many antitrust cases. It wasn't. They brought in Nick Katzenbach said to me that they really brought Don Turner into the Justice Department because most of the people they had running the antitrust division didn't necessarily know a lot about antitrust, so they were good lawyers. But Bobby Kennedy got tired of all the business people coming in during his massages and telling him his antitrust department was out of control. All right, so they just said, what can we do? So we'll get somebody who really knows about it, which was Don Turner. And I enjoyed that enormously. I was his special assistant. And working in the government, when you finish law school, you work in the government for a year, you can learn an enormous amount. You don't have to be special assistant. There are hundreds or thousands of jobs over there. And they're very interesting because you have to actually practice the thing. You actually have to know it, not theoretically, but you actually have to go out and do it. And that's a very, very good experience. And I liked very much working for Turner. I don't know how much I can say, but I guess I could say. I don't think this is newsworthy. We'd come in every morning and park down in the basement, the dingy basement of the Justice Department. And in each corner where the stairs go up, so there would be a picture of a most wanted criminal. I don't know if there still is. Is there? I doubt it. There is? Well, anyway, it was there. And there was one of them who really looked terrible. I mean, I guess it isn't a crime to look the way he did, but nonetheless. And so Turner, we go by, and Turner, who was a sort of very meek, mild person, I never would have expected this. He brought out his black crayon,
oh, gosh.
and he wrote underneath, "Portrait of J. Edgar Hoover as a young man." There we are. Well, those days have long gone, but it was fun working for Turner. Merger guidelines, interesting to those who worked on them, and the department then, was running a lot of industries. We'd have a meeting.
The department was running industry?
Yes, the movie industry. It was who was the judge up in New York? You know who it was? Famous judge, federal judge. It's the decree, the antitrust decree, the movie decree. And he was in charge. And so we had one person in the every morning we'd have a meeting, and the top heads of the different sections were there, and Kilgore was his name, and he was running the movie industry. This man, Mr. Kilgore, who I would say was a very nice guy and so forth. I'm not sure he knew that much about running the movie industry, but nonetheless. And there was another person in the meatpacking industry, and there was somebody else in Panama. I was learning a lot, and I enjoyed it. And Don gave me the job of. They had not finished with the decree for the bananas in Panama. Yeah. And so I was supposed to read through the record and get them going so we would finally get the antitrust decree against the United Fruit that had a monopoly. And it was pretty interesting. I found a telegram in that record. It said, "Sink the SS Pan Am." That was perhaps a practice of the United Fruit Company vis-a-vis its competitors. And that seemed like an unfair practice. That is the... So there were all kinds of things going on, and it was interesting. I used to write testimony for him, go up to the Hill.
But do you think the law itself, antitrust law, has changed much today?
It's gotten too, in my opinion. It's you see, antitrust. Phil Arita, I taught with Phil Arita. I taught antitrust, and the difficulty in antitrust, the fundamental problem, as we thought then, is you're trying to walk a line. And of course, the reason they brought Turner in, and Rita more than anybody, is you have to have economics. Antitrust, Rita would say, is informed by economics. Now that's a good word, informed, because it's a little bit vague. And it's not just economics. And it isn't just not economics. It is informed, and that means it has to be administrable. Which, one of the dissents, I thought, I don't know why it was a dissent, it was so convincing. I thought we should maintain and still have a strict rule of liability, not a rule of reason, for vertical price fixing. Why? Why a strict rule? Because there are instances where it is a reasonable thing to do to have vertical price fixing. You know, I don't know how much you've been studying vertical price fixing, but nonetheless, why should it be strict liability? Why should it? Because it's too complicated to try to distinguish where it is and where it is not reasonable to have it, and you don't give up much when you say it's strictly liable, and you do give up a lot of confusion when you try to separate all these things out. But that's what antitrust for Arita and for Turner and Bob Potofsky and what I call the Jody Bernstein and what I call the old antitrust gang. You know, I mean, that's pretty much what we thought. And I learned it from Turner and Arita. And probably now maybe, I don't want to insult the economists. I'm for bringing in the economists, but
A little less rule of reason.
But well, yes, bring in the economists, but it's not pure economics either. And so I will spare you my 2-hour lecture on this. Who is the?
I think we would like...
Oh, I know who wrote this. In England, it was Ted Heath, actually, who got vertical price fixing declared unlawful. And he was advised by an economist named Basil Yamey, whom I'd met. And then when I was on the court, there was that vertical price fixing case. And it was being argued by, I won't say who it was, because this was the meanest question I ever asked from the bench, ever.
Oh, you have to tell us that question.
Well, he was arguing in favor, for the rule of reason. So I said, well, what do you think Basil Yamey would have thought of that? Of course, he's never heard of Basil Yamey. I used to go out to lunch with Basil Yamey. So everybody loved us going to England. They loved it when we were in England. You know why? Because all of the civil servants in England were forbidden ever to charge their lunches to the government, unless they were entertaining a foreign visitor, professional visitor. Oh, we'd walk in the room, they'd say, we're so glad to see you. Exactly, that was absolutely true, absolutely true. But anyway.
That was a very mean question.
Yes.
I would think we'd all like to hear about your work on the Watergate prosecution.
So I had a very minor position.
Very minor position.
I did.
You joined Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox.
Yeah, but our Archibald Cox was great. I mean, he was total honesty, a truly great man in my opinion. And there were two other people who worked as it was Phil Hyman and Jim Varnberg. And they had several different things they were looking at. You have to be an expert to even know what I'm talking about on this. I mean, it wasn't just the Nixon and the break-in at the Watergate. It was also the plumbers in general. The plumbers, that was Colson and I've forgotten that, Hunt, Liddy. You can see Liddy now. I think of it from time to time. He's selling you gold on the
Was there an antitrust issue in the Watergate?
There was also an antitrust issue. The antitrust issue, and it may have started the whole thing, was because ITT, which was a famous company then, had a lobbyist in Washington named Dita Beard. And Dita Beard she'd have ideas to promote the company. One of her ideas was to take all the congressmen on a boat trip through the Panama Canal. And the president of the company vetoed that because he was afraid the boat would sink and ITT would be blamed for it. So they didn't do it. So there was what was called the Dita Beard Memo. And Jack Anderson, who was the columnist then for the Post, published the Dita Beard Memo, which he was sending to Harold Janine, who was the head of the company. And it had a lot of stuff in it about we've done this, that, and the key line was, our noble commitment has gone a long way to getting the antitrust case called off against us. Now, what was that? The IT&T owned a hotel in San Diego, and they gave it to the Republican Party to hold its convention. That was our noble commitment. And went a long way towards getting our antitrust suit called off. The antitrust suit was a suit against ITT for the acquisition of Grinnell, I think, or what was the fire extinguisher company and so forth. And they called it off after they had won in the lower court, and they compromised it out and never went to the Supreme Court and so forth. And so that looks pretty crooked.
Yes.
And so that's what the impression that led to Senate hearings, and it was all tied together into the Watergate. And my job, since I was teaching antitrust, was to take that memo and see was it true or not, which I spent the summer doing. It was great. Some of the people were in Rome. I had to go out there and interview them. And but what the sentence actually said was, Stan told me, R.E., our noble commitment, that it went a long way towards calling off, etc. Well, Stan, I can't remember his last name, but he was governor of Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And he was in charge of raising money for the party. And so it is quite possible that he did tell that to Dita Beard. But the head of the antitrust division was a completely honest man, Clerking. And he never would have done anything dishonest. A lawyer, he was a judge from Chicago. And he was talking to Erwin Griswold. And Erwin Griswold he may not have been great in his questioning of the women at the Harvard Law School, but he was an honest man. And the chances of that being dishonest, I'd say zero. And so we came to the conclusion that, yes, Stan probably told her, but it isn't a crime to lie about that. And there we are. But that's what I was doing. But of course, I listened to what other people were saying, and we'd have lunch, and we had our office building. And so it was a very interesting period of time for me. And I was down there when they fired Archie. And if you want to hear another speech on television, look at Archie's speech. Look at Archie's speech. When he was, when Nixon fired him, Nixon couldn't. What's his name? The Attorney General. What? Richardson. Richardson quit rather than fire Archie, and he quit because he told the Senate that he wouldn't fire, and he wouldn't let any interference on this
Somebody
investigation.
else quit.
Yes, Ruckelshaus. Ruckelshaus. Bork. But Bork had never promised the Senate anything. Right. Bork had never promised anybody anything. You can say that for Bork. And I remember seeing Bork and Ed Kitch over there in that office next day.
Ed Kitch at UVA?
Yeah. And Archie said to the staff, don't quit. Stay here and do your job. And then they brought in Jaworski. Mm-hmm. And that's just what the staff did. They did stay and they did do their job. And so I was lucky, very lucky, I would say, in the people I worked for. I mean, my goodness. I worked for Arthur Goldberg. What was the line? He had one line of Shakespeare that he loved to quote. Life is short. It's, what is it? It's Henry IV. Life is short. To spend it basely were too long. If it did ride upon a dial's point, still ending at the turning of the hour. Now, I have to admit that I spent several weeks trying to figure out what that meant. And I never did. I thought just trying to behave decently, I think, is what it means. And just keep going. Just keep going. And we would sometimes, you'd lose a case, we'd be in the dissent, and he'd say, okay. And I'd say, let's add 4 more things here because we are so, no, he'd say, please. They'll just add 2 more over there. He'd say, okay, we didn't get the majority, so we didn't. Now it's time to go on to the next case, and we'll see how we do on that. What do you want me to do, cry? I mean, you see? That's the kind of person he was. And so I was lucky in having worked for him. I was lucky having worked for Archie Cox, who was And I was very lucky having worked for Ted Kennedy. But that's another
That's
story,
another
I know.
story,
But
yeah.
my God, that was fun and interesting. And so there we are.
I do want to end asking you why and what made you go back to Harvard on the faculty. Was that
Now,
an odd feeling? I know.
well, we kept our house there. We have our house there. We have 3 grandchildren living in our house with us, and what we call living in the ruins of our house. But and we've always been up in Cambridge. And my goodness, somebody gave Harvard a lot of money. Perhaps it's quite different looking than when I taught there first. I mean, they have all these new buildings, and every day, if you want on the faculty, you go in and you can have lunch and you don't have to pay for it.
Don't give them ideas, please.
I mean, that was unbelievable. To me, I never saw that before. I was talking to some students about that there and saying how Harvard had changed. They said, yeah, but we're paying for that lunch. They said, I said, let's go into a different subject. But there we are.
Our students submitted some questions. May I ask you
Sure,
a few of them?
please go.
All right. Well, one of them is, if you could go back when you were in law school and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
And I still can use it. Calm down. You know, you can only control and you can only know. This is Bayless Manning told me that when I was looking for a job after Turner. He said, you're only going to know about 5% of what you'd like to know, and certainly maybe 3% of what you ought to know about the jobs that you'll choose among. You can't do more than that. And there we are. So choose. You choose, and then your life folds itself around that. Don't become a trapeze artist, I tell the graduates, unless you have special talents that perhaps some of us are unaware of. But nonetheless, within the range of reasonable choice, you'll never know. You'll never know. And that's just the way it is. And so would I still give myself that advice? Joanna, who's here, I think would say yes, absolutely. The greatest thing I thought, Sarkozy, when he was running for president, running against, what's her name, the woman whose name I can't remember suddenly. Well,
Sarkozy was running against a
well,
woman.
yeah. And he tricked her into getting annoyed at him, and she got annoyed because he said she didn't do something that she had done. And then he says, calm down, calm down. You have to be calm when you are president of France. He's about the least calm person I've ever seen in my life. But nonetheless, I think that's, you try to accept what comes along and just use your best, do your best. Do your best. There we are.
And another student wants to hear your tips for being a successful judicial law clerk.
Do the work that you are asked to do. That is extremely helpful to the judge. And beyond that, my goodness, it's lovely having law clerks. It's wonderful. And you can go in and talk about different things, and it's fun. It's fun. There are 4 now. I've always had 4 on the Supreme Court. On the Court of Appeals, there were 3. And it's just fun. They're intelligent, interesting, nice people.
I'm afraid the rest are controversial, so I'm going to go to one of the controversial ones.
You can, as I said, it's my problem.
Those are our students. One of Justice Goldberg's most influential moves was arguing against the death penalty, and he helped create the modern movement for the abolition of the death penalty. Do you agree or disagree with his position?
Well, unfortunately, this probably the person who's read that has not read my 49 pages of dissenting opinion where I say the court should reconsider that matter. And the thrust of that opinion is it's unfortunately not possible, in my opinion, to have a fair administration of the death penalty, and therefore that's a reason for reconsidering it. Well, rather than, I'm not going to repeat the 49 pages, but the case, maybe there were only 48, but the case is called Glossop, and there you will have more probably than you would like to know.
Well, I can't thank you enough We've enjoyed hearing you for the second time.
Well, that's very nice of you.
And we thank you very much. Would you join me in thanking Justice Breyer for this second conversation?